Lesson 43. In this grammar presentation, we'll be talking about the principal parts of verbs and be introduced to the aorist passive and the future passive. Principal parts. In many Greek textbooks and grammars, verbs are listed along with their principal parts. This is an example of the first 5 of 6 principal parts of the verb pao, I stop. These correspond to the following first-person singular forms, that is, the I forms of these verbs. First of all, we have the present active, I stop, that's pao. Then we have future active, I shall stop, pao-so. Aorist active, I stopped, epausa. Perfect active, I have stopped, pepauka. And perfect middle passive, I have been stopped, pepaumai. Could also be, I have stopped myself. So these are very helpful when we are especially forming verbs ourselves. It really helps to know all the different principal parts because there are lots of irregularities with Greek verbs. The 6th principal part is for the aorist passive. This is the final of the principal parts, and we're going to learn what it means. Unlike the other principal parts, this one can be hard to predict. For very regular verbs that end in vowels or diphthongs, the stem for the aorist passive is usually formed by adding theta. So for instance, a verb like paideo, I educate, you would drop the omega to get the normal present stem, and then to form the passive stem, the aorist passive stem, we're simply going to add theta on top of that because the normal stem ends in a vowel or a diphthong, in this case the diphthong o. And if we were to continue forming the rest of the aorist passive for this, we would have the meaning we would expect. Aorist passive, I was educated. Aorist was, passive educated. On the next slide, you'll find the aorist passive stems of the irregular verbs from the readings. This is not by any means an exhaustive list. This is just some verbs. They happen to be the ones we'll see in the readings. So we've got verbs we know, like grapa, I write. Verbs we haven't really seen before, krina, I judge, and stella, I send. Souls, though, we know, I save. Paino, I appear. Perra, I carry. And we have the aorist passive stems here. With a verb like grapa, it's actually exactly the same as the present stem. With a verb like krina, which ends in a nu, it's a little different. All of these are irregular. We could not guess from just the normal forms of the verbs what their aorist passive stems would be. Other ones we'll see are more regularly formed, like paideo. So this may be handy to refer back to as you're going through the readings. Now, let's take a look at the actual endings and forms in all the different moods of the aorist passive. We'll start with the indicative. So we've got our verb pao, I stop, and here, as follows, are the principal parts, the 6 principal parts. Pao, pauso, I shall stop, I stopped, I have been stopped, and then we have epaust, and I left off the ending here because we're going to see that in a second. This is effectively the aorist passive stem, paust, with the past augment thrown on there. One thing to notice is that this is irregular. We would not have expected a sigma to creep in there. We would expect this to be formed like the aorist passive stem of paideo, for instance. So we're going to take this aorist passive stem and the augment and plug it into all of these places. And that leaves us with everything but the endings. For the endings, we're going to turn, this is not too difficult, to the imperfect tense of the verb aime, I am. The imperfect tense, I was, you were, he, she, or it was, etc. We have these forms. And these are going to be almost exactly the forms that we use to form the aorist passive indicative, except for just these things. With these exceptions, we're going to use all the stuff in blue. So that's what our endings look like. They don't look like passive endings. They look like active endings, kind of interestingly. So these are the forms of the aorist indicative passive. Paustein, I was stopped. You were stopped. He, she, or it was stopped, etc. Now, to look at the other moods, the infinitive, the participle, we've got those up there. We are going to start once again with our aorist passive stem. That's the Paust without the past augment. So we're going to plug that into all of these places. And we're not going to dwell here in the grammar presentation on the endings, but these are the endings. They are not exactly new. The imperative has some new endings, in particular second person singular. But if you look at the subjunctive endings, these are actually the subjunctive forms of the verb aimer, I am. And the optative forms as well are the optative forms of that same verb. So we actually have quite a bit of reuse of forms, recycling of forms here. The infinitive, the aorist passive infinitive, something like to have been stopped in the aorist, is new. We'll want to take note of that. And the participle endings are very similar to the adjective heis, one, hen, one in the neuter. The only difference is we don't have mia in the feminine, but this esa, and that's declined like a normal first declension feminine noun. So you want to refer back to these. It'll take a little while before we are comfortable with them, I am sure, but here they are, the forms of the aorist passive, in the indicative, imperative, subjunctive, optative, infinitive, and participle. Now, let us turn to the future passive, which would be translated something like, I shall be stopped. So first of all, we are going to take not just our aorist passive stem, Paust, but we're also going to take the eta from these endings. That's going to leave us with this here, Pauste, and what we're going to do is add the letter that is characteristic of the future tense in general, that is sigma. And this gives us our stem, our aorist future stem, our future aorist stem, and to this stem we are going to add normal middle passive endings, that is amai, etai, ameta, esta, antai. These are just the forms of the present middle passive indicative. So it's kind of a mix of things, really. These are the future passive indicative forms. I can translate this as something like, I shall be stopped, you will be stopped, he, she, or it will be stopped, etc. We do have to look at a couple other things for the future passive. We need to look at the optative, the infinitive, and the participle. Once again, we're going to start with our future passive stem, which is that paustes with the sigma. We're going to plug that in. And just as we saw before in the indicative, where we have basically middle passive endings, present middle passive endings, we're going to do the same thing here. The endings here are going to look exactly like the endings for the future middle. Exactly like it, except that our stem is different. So you want to take a look at these as well. We will definitely see a future passive participle in the readings, so take a look. Future passive. For the forms, you want to take a look at page 64. You'll find both the future passive and the aorist passive. And we have a whole lot of pages, 20 pages of principal parts of irregular verbs. There's a really handy list of both very common irregular verbs and some less common irregular verbs, but all those forms the grammar puts at your fingertips. Thank you very much.